The myth of a powerful but unruly monarch is familiar to any culture. From Chinese Emperor Xi to Caligula from Rome, we keep a collective record of the leaders who are as wealthy as they are cruel. The archetype of a tyrant is embedded in our literature and culture, be it Fafnir from the Northern mythology or Smaug from more modern culture. The cautionary tale of our past, though, don't prevent us from giving power to the rich and wealthy of today. As kids in some magical story, we hope that the wizard of democracy or free market is going to come and save us from the tyrannical kings. Just recently, Elon Musk purchased the Twitter in the attempt of save the free speech, where now the free speech is only defined by the majesty himself and not by the users or the sponsors of the platform. But submitting our powers to billionaires is merely a trend, and Elon Musk's case is not exclusive. As billionaires of today are changing the world through lobbying, indirect government interference, and destructive philanthropy. And it's not news that the wealth gap is growing, but how big can it become, and what happens when the 1% becomes 0.01%? Welcome. This is Uncentered series where I take a look at the political literature. And today we're taking a look at Plutocracy, specifically this book, Plutocracy by Cristia Freeland. Plutocracy in general is the rule by the rich, but it can coexist with some other systems, for example, oligarchy or democracy, and even if you are completely unlucky, kakistocracy too. Kakistocracy is the rule by the most unqualified people. Today we're going to take a look at ultra-rich of the present and of the future, and we will see why the system of this power and wealth interference might as well collapse on itself. So it is not a secret that we exist in the world of the billionaires. The earliest modern billionaire is Rockefeller, who acquired his wealth through selling oil and gas. But he is not alone. Through history, there were multiple monarchs and famous people who acquired tremendous wealth. But today we're living in the world where the population of billionaires is really big. We have 3,000 billionaires at the time of recording of this video. Together, the billionaires of today keep close to $12 trillion, which equates to roughly 12 to 13% of the world's GDP. And it is not a fair comparison, but because these people are so rich, it makes no meaning to compare them to the income of a regular person, and instead we're comparing them to the country's GDPs, which is just another factor that highlights the problem of inequality. And Freeland highlights two stories that bring up this inequality. One happening in the developed West. On one side, we face the drop in the number of the jobs due to automation and technological advantage. But also there is a stagnation of the wages. As the profits go up, the wages remain in place. But meanwhile, a different story is unfolding in the countries outside of the global north. Such things as the child labor, unpaid labor, really low wages, and unsafe working conditions are the attributes of the developing countries' capitalism. Even the countries with the less blazing capitalism, like Netherlands and France, have significant level of inequality, and this inequality keeps rising. Some, though, keep winning, and those who win in capitalism win big. The typical pyramid of wealth, as proposed by the capitalists of the 20th century, but also by the Karl Marx, is not really stable anymore. As the wealth keeps going up and less is left at the bottom, the pyramid is mutating, and it seems that the top is going to fly off sometime soon. I found this champagne distribution graph, and arguably if you look at the Freeland's book, even champagne glass chart is not really correct because there is significant inequality level at the top of the pyramid. It's supposed to look more like martini glass or maybe even a tea at this point. So both in the countries with the old capitalism and the younger capitalist countries, there are millionaires and billionaires. Those who are willing to step on the heads of their fellow citizens to acquire tremendous wealth are then going to join the international elite. Cristia Freeland has a significant coverage of this topic, where she talks about the international rich. Now, instead of having the elite that is located in one little country, you have the elite that is shared internationally. The global billionaires are having more in common with each other than they have in common with you. They are isolated both in their lifestyle and wealth. Your chances of meeting a billionaire in the supermarket are extremely low, even if you live in the downtown New York. This isolation is only magnified by the use of the power. Today, the wealth is the power, as the wealth allows you to acquire the companies, resources, and also labor of the people. This labor might even include paying politicians for the lobbying. This is what Freeland calls the legal bribing in her book, the ability of the super rich modify the politics of the states. And in countries like China with slightly different forms of capitalism, the rich are encouraged to join the party. Instead of separating the government and the super rich, China instead forms the culture where the super rich are encouraged to participate in the state politics. So if you are ever feel like your government is changing and you're voting for different people on different sides and nothing changes, that's because probably the changes were never meant for you. Directly or indirectly, the democratic states and even non-democratic states like Saudi Arabia allow the rich and wealthy to rule their states. With access to money and power, plutocrats spread their wishes across the world. Sometimes you have the rich participating in the government, you also have lobbying, but there is also philanthropy. And philanthropy doesn't seem like a bad thing, but it is actually really destructive when done by the billionaires. In less developed countries, the billionaires are injecting large amounts of money in an attempt to improve something. And usually what they approve is to their choice. These large injections of money disrupt the grassroots groups that are working in the said countries. And even in the developed democracies of the West, philanthropy can be destructive. A lot of the billionaires are actually sponsoring media and different sorts of think tanks. For example, Daily Wire would never be possible without the donations of millions of dollars from the billionaires. But while the wealthy are forming the ruling class of their own, something else is also happening at the bottom. Of course, every kingdom starts at the bottom. Most of the countries in the West are facing the housing crisis, and the wages are becoming stagnant and were stagnant for several decades now. Millennials and Gen Zs of the West will be one of the first generations to actually lose the wealth compared to the previous generation. And it is only a question of time until the same cycle continues in the developing countries as they progress further into the capitalism. In the West also we face the issue of rising debt. And a good example of that is my generation and myself personally, whereas my house, my education, my car, and my phone are all on the loan. The loan that I eventually will pay out, that's assuming if I live long enough. Those that are facing issues in the younger capitalist countries are also suffering, mostly due to the loss of the livelihoods due to business disruption and new models and corporations from the West coming in and destroying the small businesses and organizations. Also by the means of the extensive labor, which is close to the slave labor in both wage, safety conditions, and the work hours. And Cristia Freeland suggests slightly different look at how we form this bottom of the society internationally, whereas she proposes that there is an international leveling. In the globalist economy, our wages are actually getting closer to the wages of the workers in the developing world. So as the pay to the workers in the developing countries is slightly increasing from $1 to $2 per day, the Western workers' wages become stagnant, and eventually we will meet in the middle. And just as the billionaires are uniting internationally, this group of the poor and middle class, or whatever is left of middle class, workers is now also forming the international group. There is a really high chance that you will meet the person that enjoys the same music, art, and culture that you, but they are located completely on a different continent in a different country. And of course, we can't talk about the bottoms without talking about the middle class. The middle class, which is evaporating really fast. There is a point in the capitalist progression that the developed countries already reached, where your education doesn't really correlate the amount of wealth that you will make in your lifetime. This old education to wealth transition remains still in place in the countries with the younger capitalism for now, where the people who previously worked in the factories can send their kids into universities and hope for the higher wages. But it's not true in the West. As Freeland suggests, most of the wealth right now is moving to the service workers who actually manage finances of the billionaires. That means that the groups that previously made the middle class are slowly pulled to the bottom. So as more and more people fall to the bottom, the pyramid is splitting. And I'm going to slightly change the pyramid that we have over here, that is like the typical distribution of wealth as projected in the 20th century. Whereas the middle class is now pretty much gone, though we'll talk about it in a second. But even at the bottom of the pyramid, some extremely lucky will still make the cut to go into the middle class. In the late capitalism, the middle class is made of people who are directly servicing the ultra-rich. Those are celebrity chefs, stylists, and designers, also the people who manage the finances of the ultra-rich. Based on extremely high skill and knowledge, luck, and good self-marketing, some people will be able to go into the service of the ultra-rich, thus sharing the crumbs of their table.
The flavor's amazing.
The problem is, though, that even with this million-dollar wealth, the middle class is not able to reach the gap into the super wealthy. You don't see Gordon Ramsay or Jonathan Adler jumping into buying newspapers, social platforms, or lobbying politicians. This is because even though they have significant wealth by being celebrity whatever, they still don't have enough leverage to pull the lobbying or affect the politics. This middle class also includes the layer of the protection, police, army and the private armies of the ultra-rich. And there is an issue for the ultra-rich and the military. The threat coming from the organizations which are typically in the favor of the power is described in the book Survival of the Rich, which is a story for another video. But in general, there is an issue for the ultra-rich where the gap between them and everybody else is so big that there is no way that the head of their own security will not shoot them in case of the crisis. Even though we see prisons, police, and private armies as oppressive institutions, they still have families to feed and lives to live. And in case of any sort of crisis, all those people would rather stay together with their social structures rather than with billionaires. There is no cohesive connection between the ultra-rich and everybody else. And the consequence of this gap in power is outlined by Freeland in her book, where she talks about not just the power between rich and everybody else, but the power between the ultra-rich and rich. In the good old days, Karl Marx proposed the idea of the capitalist crisis. Marx and even socialists of today saw it as a revolution. Once the poor are poor enough and have nothing but their chains, they will eat the rich. Though Marx didn't account that the poor will also have hot showers, fully stuffed grocery stores, and Marvel movies. This surprisingly was enough for us to abandon our class consciousness. He also didn't foresee the international elite of the super-rich. In the times of the Karl Marx, the ultra-rich were living in the center of your own city. Today, you have the ultra-rich that you never see because they live in different countries, have several passports, and perhaps also bunkers to hide from you. There is also the idea of the scorching planet. The capitalism is the constantly progressive system on the planet with limited resources, and inevitably the resources will run out. Though the problem with that is that it will take several generations to use up the planet resources, and ideas of the climate change or destruction of the planet are not really in the interest of the ultra-rich because they don't even care for the people who live today. We're not even talking about people who will live in 3 generations from now. Good day to anybody watching this in 2122. But there is one more issue that is described by the accelerationism. Accelerationism is a very fringe and dark ideology, but accelerationism also provides the idea that we should just put the capitalism on steroids and keep going until the collapse. And the collapse that accelerationist proposed is embedded in the capitalism itself. As the self-reinforcing system, capitalism of today will progress into more and more inequality into each next cycle. And by the way, Freeland doesn't really talk about accelerationism, though it would be nice if she did. And there are several factors that go into the acceleration of the capitalism. One factor is the caste system. So the capitalism and late capitalism forms this really isolated upper layer. The upper layer then marries and forms the relationship with each other, keeping the wealth on top of the system, similar to monarchy. People who are ultra-rich do not participate in the events, culture, and the organizations of the regular people, outside of the cases when it's required for the self-promotion, of course. Second issue is the nepotism, whereas the wealth is shared between the parents and the kids. This is, of course, typical for any layer of the society, not just the ultra-rich, but the kids of the ultra-rich are able to participate in highest education, and they're able to start the businesses with really low risk because they're backed up by the wage of their parents. By the age of the 20, the kids of the ultra-rich are already outcompeting every most talented child from the paper-thin middle class. And the third factor is the growing gap between the wealth produced by the wages and wealth produced by the investments. Ultra-rich really don't have to work. The money works for them. For every millionaire who invests 10 million into the successful project, there is a billionaire who invests 10 billions into the successful projects too. Thus, the person who invested 10 billions makes exponentially more money than a millionaire. So in the end, the ultra-rich are not only facing the war against the poor and the war against the scorching planet that they produce, but they are also facing the war against the rich and other ultra-rich as far as they're willing to go on top of the pyramid. And as the book goes, Freeland talks quite a bit about the self-made billionaires. Actually, she spends a good third of this book, I would say, just outlining all the different situations and scenarios of why you personally will never make it. While there were billionaires who started with minimal backing in the end of the 20s and sometimes really early 21st century, and those cases still happen in the developing countries. But in our current society, the kids will inherit the wealth of their parents. Thus, they already start up as billionaires and create wider gap between the ultra-rich and the rich. And of course, the ultra-rich face the issue of disattachment from the rest of the society. Where else there is no self-made billionaire, there is also no ethical billionaires. Billionaires face highly aggressive competitions and are willing to call really tough and cruel choices on their workforce and co-workers in the attempt to build higher wealth. Nobody goes to the top of the ladder based on the cooperation and mutualism. There is also no such thing as the socialist billionaire, no matter how many toilets Bill Gates decides to build in India. Ultra-rich get there due to their knowledge and skill set and also highly aggressive and cruel actions that they take. They lack loyalty to their own teams and they lack mercy for their workers. It takes a particular character to close up your factory in the North America and move all this workforce to the developing country, where the person then later make the workforce work for extremely low wages in highly unsafe conditions and think that this was, after all, a right choice. A right choice simply based on the fact that you are making a lot of money and not based on any social factors. The wealth becomes a token of power in the late capitalism. Power that people raised for centuries now can be physically acquired. As if there is an equality at the bottom, there is also really high inequality at the top. And this is something that Freeland talks quite a bit in her book as well. Because what happens when you take people with this very questionable ethics and make them form one solid international caste? There are, of course, historical cases when the ultra-rich will be fighting with each other. Those usually include wars, coups, and murders. But assuming the system doesn't change, what happens when the ultra-rich have just very few individuals who own the most wealth at the very top? Let me present you with another character. Cristia the Deathless appears in the Slavic folklore at the end of the 12th century. Cristia the Deathless is often described as a skinny, bony old man. He does wear the golden crown and has all of the attributes of the power. But his kingdom has no servants, he has no family and no heirs. Cristia has the wealth and the eternal life, but nothing else. He is the king of the kingdom, of nobody to rule over but himself. The Cristia the Deathless is the ultimate billionaire of the late capitalism. Capitalism doesn't facilitate any of the good human qualities. On opposite, late capitalism facilitates the worst of the people to gain the most of the power. People who can be quite disattached from the reality or try to form the reality according to their own wish, disregarding everybody else. This is the wealth and power that does not and will not benefit humanity. Power in the wealth, in the case of the ultra-rich, are pure self-expression. And Elon Musk, of course, is the perfect example, not just with his Twitter purchase, but even with how he treats his own kids. Elon Musk tries to express the control over the world and pure power by the means of breeding his own kin. His children are just the attempt to spread the seeds of the greater father and not the actual human beings. Though of course they are actual humans, so they deny the gift of their great father once they grow up. And it is of course hard and stupid to predict the future. We as the international humanity pulled ourselves out of pretty hard situations, and the late capitalism may be just another thing that we are able to solve. But if the system progresses, we will end up with the very top of the ultra-rich, who have no choice but to isolate themselves from the rest of the society, be it through their own lack of social skills as they are competing in a cruel competition against each other, but also in fear from the poor that can eat them, the fear that your own wife and your own children and your own friends are willing to backstab you, leading to further and further isolation of these particular individuals from the rest of the society as their wealth accumulates, but their power starts to cut off. And that's why I thought about the Cristia the Deathless at the first place, as the Elon Musk attempt to conquer Mars is seeming to me the same as the kingdom of the Cristia the Deathless. The richest man of today tries to control the land that is extremely isolated from the rest of the world, lifeless and dead. The richest man, just like Cristia the Deathless, can be left alone and in the dark to rule the kingdom of nowhere else but himself. Thank you for joining me today. This was Plutocracy and Plutocrats by Cristia Freeland. I know my last video about the propaganda gained some traction, so I will be making another one in the week, and I will probably be alternating back and forth between the series for now. And again, thank you for watching, and see you on the next book.